I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you all today about this topic. I wanted to just start um, by telling, I guess, a little bit of a story about how networking has been for me over the years. So over the last 25 years, I've had to do quite a lot of networking. Obviously, I've worked in international conservation over that time, been really, really lucky to have the opportunity to go different places, meet different people, um, and in my kind of work to focus on building conservation capacity. But I want to be really honest with you. I don't see myself as a super duper, the best of the range networker. I'm not a huge extrovert. I don't kind of bound into a room of strangers absolutely confidently. That's not my natural kind of state. It's something that I've had to really work at over the years. And it is one of those things that the more you do, the easier it becomes. And I'm sure all of you who are here will have had some experience in networking and perhaps can already identify with that. But earlier in my career, I used to dread the open networking sessions at conferences. I remember talking to people thinking, I must be really interesting here. But people were like, I don't know if you've ever had this or you've done it to somebody else, but looking over my shoulder, like for the next person to talk to. And it can be a real like confidence kicker. I actually met some really interesting people at those kinds of events early in my career, like who were just like me, hiding in the toilets, washing their hands for an incredibly long time, taking a deep breath before going back out there. I don't know if anybody else identifies with that. So putting myself out there, I recognize can feel a bit risky and uncomfortable. And some people are much more kind of naturally able to do that, and some people have to work at it more. Um, yeah, and it's one of those things. Happily, the more practiced you are, the easier it gets. I don't feel stressed out at the thought of it anymore. I've gained confidence, but I still don't take it lightly. And I do really recognize that to do a really good job in networking and build relationships from scratch, it really takes effort and energy and intentionality. The way I turned around my fear of networking was very much when I started to ask for advice. I looked at people who I thought were really good at networking, and I asked them about how do I become a more successful networker? What can I do differently that will make me feel okay about this situation? And a lot of what I'm bringing here today is kind of a culmination of some of those pieces of advice I've gathered over the year. And actually, it's a lovely conversation starter. If you're not feeling confident in a room, is to ask for somebody's help in terms of, how do you do this? And it really gets things going. It's quite a nice way to get started if you're in that situation. I want to say, like in particular, there's a couple of chief executive officers that I've worked with over the years in international organizations who caught my eye. So Mark Rose and Mike Rands, if anybody knows those people, they have very, very different styles, but I could spot that they were really very successful. So they were two of the first people I asked for advice on. I could see that people trust them, people wanted to support their cause, understood their value, all the things that I admire in a networker. And they actually helped make introductions for me after I'd opened up to them that I was feeling a bit anxious about networking. And they offered some of these tips that I'm going to share today. I also, in this introduction, kind of want to reference the fact that online network has become so much more prolific, especially over the last 4 years. And again, I've been looking and asking advice to learn those skills, and I'm still gathering information in that area, and suspect the learning will keep happening. But I'm really looking forward to sharing with you where I am at today. And I hope that there are some opportunities for you to share some of the experience that you have too. I'm going to be sharing quite a lot of lists because it is collected information that I've gathered over the year, but I've put lots of text on the slides, so hopefully any of you who are looking at this in a second language, you have a slightly better chance. Before we move on, I want to say a huge thanks to Sue and Sandra, who are our interpreters today, who are helping translate into Spanish and French. So thanks ever so much for your support today. Just to start with, before I move on to the next slide, I would love if you could have a little think about how you feel about networking. I'd love to have an idea of where you're at. So in the chat, if you feel like if you were able to post a sentence that describes how you feel about networking at the moment. I've just shared how I feel about it. I would just love to see where you're at, so it will help me as we go through. So please take this moment to just pop something into the chat, a sentence that is just how you feel about networking. I can manage. It's a necessary thing. It's a skill. It is a skill that can be practiced. I agree. Intimidating can be. Depends on the group, doesn't it, sometimes, and the setup. I think you can set up a space so it's less intimidating if you're the one who's running the networking event. Talking to strangers, yeah. Yeah, and do please write. If you're not English speaking, feel free to write in French or Spanish, if that's easier. It's a necessary skill set and you could manage. I think lots of people just do manage, but we were talking about before we invited everyone in, we were having a little conversation about how a lot of these things that we're going to talk about today are absolutely common sense, but very rarely do we stop and reflect on how we're doing something or how we can be more intentional doing something to get better outcomes. So it's that reflection time that I hope this hour is going to be useful for us all today. Thank you very much for sharing that. So just before we go much further, just to be clear, what are we talking about here? This is a quote that I pulled from a paper at Barrow and Hunter in 2007, but I thought it was a really nice short summary of how I understand networking to be. So creating a fabric of personal contacts who will provide support, feedback, insights, resources, and information. And these things are really important for supporting a resilient organization and essential for fundraising. So knowing we've been supported through CEPF and Canary to run these webinars, I'm conscious that networking can be one of those solutions around really building that financial resilience that we're looking at in the project we're running as part of that. So there's a few different ways you can think about different purposes of networking. And I've read quite a few papers on it at this point. There's one way of looking at it where you can say, well, we have our day-to-day networking, our operational networking, and this helps you to manage your kind of working responsibilities internally in your job day to day. And that's just your everyday, doesn't really push us out of the box once we know the people that we need in order to do our jobs effectively at the most kind of basic level. We're networked enough to get on. Then a kind of step beyond that is personal networking. And this is about boosting your own personal development. So who are the people that you can reach out to get a bit more, to grow personally, to be able to have more influence and impact perhaps, and to be able to help yourself to grow. And then there's a kind of final area of networking that's more strategic. It's the kind that stretches you out of your normal spaces that you operate. So it can open your eyes to new innovations and stakeholders. It can help teach you about things that you don't understand enable you to meet the kinds of people that you would never normally talk to, but might have a really interesting different perspective or a different offer that could really help you achieve your goals. So that's the one, that's the most underused kind of network, that's the hardest to reach into, but often you get the kind of biggest wins from, but it really needs effort. So that's how I'm thinking about networking. Some of the advantages, again, a lot of these are very, very obvious. There's an opportunity for exchanging ideas, connecting with different people. The more you do it, the more it can boost your confidence and it can boost your social well-being. The more you network with people, the more you have people to turn to when you need them. And you need to build up that network before you really need them, ideally. So it's a very, very useful from that point of view. It can bring support and resources. It expands your visibility and potentially your influence. And it can help you build resilience as a result of all these things. I think these are all fairly sensible, but I think it's quite useful to outline at the start. And also to make the point early on that networking is very much about cultivating relationships. It's not just that working event where you go and you are brave enough to have a conversation with someone a bit scary. It's what you do with that contact once you've got it. So that real cultivation of a relationship, it's a long, steady process, and it's around building trust and establishing something where you're able to get benefit from each other. It should be mutually beneficial. So you have to look at what you can offer as well as what you might gain. And I think that's a mistake that some people make, that actually it can be really helpful to go into the situation to say, I have something to offer here. And think about, rather than going, I really need some funding, so I'm going to go and talk to that person because I might be able to persuade them. You need to think about what they might want out of it. And somebody told me once that networking is not so much about hunting, it's about farming. So that's the little gem that I keep in my head, that recognizing that farming requires time and energy and patience and commitment in order for the crops to flourish. It's a long-term process. And so it's really recognizing that at the outset. So here's a question for you. Again, just helping us to have a little think through and reflect on where you are in your networking. What do you find challenging? So some of you might have put a couple of things in the first thing in the chat when we first asked for input. But is there something specifically that you find challenging about network? And if you have something, could you pop it in the chat for me? And we'll see what we've got in this group. What are the things that are the hard things in networking? Fear of rejection. That's interesting. Well, we'll talk a little bit about how we might be able to think of overcoming that a little coming up. Thank you for that. How to move things on to the next level after the initial interaction. Yeah, that's really interesting. Self-confidence to approach. Yep, I can identify with that. Following up. Yeah. Building trust at the beginning is challenging. Okay. Not being able to offer something of value to the other person. That's interesting. I think usually there is a something. It's a trick to find it, and it's how you have the conversation in order to bring that out. That's a really interesting observation. Waiting to be contacted as opposed to reaching out and making the contact. So it's really the energy it takes to reach out in the first place is challenging, and you can't always expect somebody to come back. Thank you for those insights. Some of the things that more broadly people find challenging, I put a few things around what holds people back in networking that we kind of see again and again. firstly, as humans and social beings, although some of us are more social than others, we do tend to be drawn to similar kinds of people. So people who are very similar to us, it's easy to have conversations. We have similar interests, similar things in common. It's easy to have those conversations. That can stop us doing that strategic kind of networking that I talked about, because we're just hanging around people who tend to agree with us anyway, rather than having that opportunity to influence or access things that our normal group doesn't have. So we tend to be drawn to similar kinds of people. Self-confidence came up in somebody's comment, and it can be challenging for people to go out of their comfort zone. There's another point here that I've come up with before, where I've known people who can just feel quite negatively about networking as a thing. It takes time to do, but also it can feel quite manipulative, like a bit of a fake environment where you're, being nice to people and building relationships without, if you're doing it sort of in an unclear way, it can just seem a bit like you're trying to get something out of someone. So if you're having a conversation with a donor and all you're really interested in is getting the money out of them, not learning about them as a person necessarily, it can feel like you're being quite manipulative in order, just making friends in order to get what you want. So some people do feel that. The biggest one, I think, tends to be that lack of focus. If you don't have a goal identified, if you don't know what you want to get out of it, it can feel a bit of a waste of time. And that's something I want to focus on a little bit today, because I think that's something that requires a bit of time and thought ahead, but can really make everything worthwhile in the longer term. Oh, I've got pop-ups coming. That's really unhelpful. Oh, sorry. So yeah, I've already covered selfish approaches. And then geography is the other one, kind of recognizing that networking face-to-face can be very hard if you live on a small island, or if you're isolated for whatever reason. It can be quite difficult to see people face-to-face. And so we have to come up with other ways to do that. So just recognizing that. One of those things that I mentioned was around confidence. And so for that, I wanted to introduce, I don't know whether any of you have come across the API model before, but this is something I found really useful. I went to it was a women's leadership training quite a few years ago. And they introduced this model to me, and it really made me think about how I was thinking about networking and getting the most out of interactions I had. I think it just focuses you in on specific areas. So this model was developed by Professor Peter Hawkins, and it's aimed at building confidence and trust and influence through the development of 3 core leadership qualities. So one of those is authority, one is presence, and one is impact. Has anyone come across this before? Just post in the chat if you have. I'm interested to know. So we'll start with the first one. On authority, I don't mean in the traditional sense. It's kind of about what and who you know and the experience and achievements you've gained so far. And that's what allows you to be at the table in the first place. So it's kind of looking back on what you've achieved, which has got you to be invited and to be in this space at this moment. So this is about tapping into your unique strengths, depths of knowledge, and your experience. And this builds a sense of self-confidence and self-esteem, which others will perceive as your authority. So it's your right to be there. And recognizing your value will increase your confidence when networking. So it's worth spending a little bit of time thinking about that. So what is the authority that you bring into any given space? What gives you a right to be in that space? What do you bring? What experiences, what skills, what knowledge do you bring that other people might not have, that you can recognize and can bring you confidence, but also will help other people recognize your value when you're networking. So that's what the authority piece was about. Presence is more about the here and now. So it's about how you relate with others, being fully attentive, reading what's going on in the moment, being able to respond to the energy in the room, tapping into that, building empathy into your relationships, and making sure that you take into account all the stakeholders that you need to in that place at that time. So it's about how you present yourself in that moment. And then impact is more future facing. So it's about transforming agendas and mindsets, creating an emotional shift in the room. So it's the measure of the difference between what you say and suggest and what's actually then accepted and followed by other people. So if you've enlightened somebody in a conversation you've had and they go away with that, that's the impact you've had. You'll have come across many people that have a deep knowledge or a burning passion for an issue, but too few of them have or work consciously to develop the trust of others. And working on this can kind of really bring about that impact shift in the longer term. So in terms of how you might use this going forward, you can use this as a kind of means of self-evaluation. So you can look at it, and for each quality, you can kind of think about rating yourself. How am I doing on authority on a scale from 1 to 10? You know, where am I? What am I actually doing to demonstrate this? Quality, is this a quality I should be working on? How could I work on it? What would be of most benefit to me in my career or the team or the organization I'm working for? So just working through each of those points and thinking about, where am I on this? Am I doing everything I could be doing? And the more you work on these 3 areas, the more you're able to build this confidence and trust and influence. And I'm talking about this from a place of actually trying it on this one. So this is not just a model I've picked out of a paper. This is something I've looked at myself, and I really feel like it's made a difference in terms of how intentional I am going into conversations. And it's made me reflect on myself and where I need to build, which I haven't got already. So just one I would recommend, worth looking at. I'm sure you could do just a search for API model or Peter Hawkins if you were interested in seeing this anymore. Another key point which I talked about was like being clear about your aims. Why are you doing this? So there's something here about knowing exactly what you want out of your networking. There's just a few ideas I've listed here. But the point of this slide really is just about the value of defining your goals. Are you looking for ways to learn about how others have overcome similar challenges for you? Are you looking for money? Are you looking to raise your profile for a particular for a particular personal goal? Have a real think about why you want to do this, and that will impact the kinds of things that you might say to people, the kinds of people that you might approach if you're going into a networking room, for example, rather than a specific one-on-one, or the people that you might reach out to online or in person. So one of the first steps, maybe once you've identified what you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve, is really thinking about, okay, if I know my goal, who can I reach out to here? How can I find people to reach out to that are going to help me with that goal? There's a book that I would recommend called Who is in Your Personal Boardroom by King and Scott, which I think is really interesting. It helps you really think about your own personal network, and helps you think about making sure you've got a balanced network. Often we have a lot of one type of people in our network, but we might not stretch across all these things. So I'm going to go over some of the categories that they think about, and it might just be interesting for you to kind of pause and have a think about these things for yourself. Who have you got that helps you in these areas at the moment in the point you are in your careers? So the first one I've got there is when you're looking for information, And there's a few categories they have here. I think the key ones for this conversation are experts, inspirers, and navigators. So an expert is someone who gives advice based on their sector or a challenge that they have specific expertise on. So if you're looking to achieve something about a certain place, you might find somebody who's expert in the Bahamas or expert on a certain kind of species, or knows all about how to access money from impact investors or whatever. These are the sorts of people. Then you've got inspirers. They're the kinds of people that inspire you with new ideas and bring fresh thinking. So helping you think differently to what you normally may think, bringing in new ideas. They may be really tapped into other networks and be able to bring you other kinds of thinking that you haven't really thought about before. Then navigator, that's somebody who can tell you who you need to know, who does what and how things work. So those people who seem to know everybody and can tap you into the right person whenever you need it. So those people who can connect you and help you find your way to the person that you want. So it's worth having a little reflect of those kind of three types of people. Who have you got in your network who can help you with those sorts of things? The next category is about power. So here we've got the unlockers, the sponsors, the influencers, and the connectors. An unlocker is someone who provides access to resources. So these are the people with the money, the data. They have access to people's time that could help you. The sponsors, they speak out to endorse you and your ideas to senior or other important people. So those sorts of people who can endorse can be really, really valuable to know. So it might not be always about you going to the person with the money immediately. It's finding the friends of those people, of the person who has the money. So it's really thinking about that. Who have you got in your networks that can do that? Influencers are people who work behind the scenes to win support and help you get things done. Connectors are people who make introductions and connect you with people who can help you. So these are all really powerful people who can move along your aims. Have a little think about who you might have. The development category is more about how for you personally, helping you in your journey personally to be able to achieve these goals. So we've got the improver. That's somebody who gives candid and constructive feedback on your performance in your development. It may be, you might include, if you've got a line manager or somebody who you very, someone senior and very experienced who you might admire, might be that sort of person who's very open to giving feedback. A challenger, that's somebody who challenges your decisions and thinking and helps you see your errors and blind spots. I think we all know people who are really good at doing that for us and can do it in a way that we can accept that feedback. But again, our tendency to stick with people who agree with us can sometimes stop us from finding these challenges, but they can be really important in developing our thinking and helping us get to where we need to be. And then finally, that nerve giver. Who are the people in your life that strengthen your resolve at difficult times and give you a sense of purpose and really support you to get up there and get out there and do what you need to do? For me, that book was quite helpful in terms of just thinking through the kinds of people I have in my life that could do that, and whether I'm asking. So you might have one person who plays 6 or 7 of those roles. And are you asking too much of that person? Do you need to think of other people, and who can help you think of those other people? So just having a bit of a reflection on the people who are in your network already, who could help you expand your network. And just to create that link, approaches to finding people may include attending events, using online platforms, and then the option of obviously directly reaching out to individuals. And I've got just one slide here on online presence. And actually, I think online is increasingly more important in terms of how we do our networking more broadly. Since the COVID pandemic, more people are working remotely. Networking in the charity sector has changed hugely. In the conservation sector, conservation sector is no different, but where we're working internationally, or our networks go beyond our geographic boundaries where we can see people face to face easily, there's more and more people who are speaking to their peers in digital spaces. And I think we've all probably found out by now that this has positives and negatives. Networking is no longer limited by location, but it can be really hard to know if the relationships you're building are beneficial. It's hard to know what's a real relationship or what's not quite a real relationship. There's a whole range of sites, obviously, that you can access. Sites such as LinkedIn give you kind of those direct, accessible channels of communications where you can uncover new opportunities, learn things you haven't learnt about before, and it can be a good way to frequently update your network. So for these kinds of sites, this is very obvious, so I'm not going to press it for too long, but it's all about making sure you've got profiles if you want to get yourself or your goal out there. If you've got a profile, can you find people who might be interested? Using that thinking about people piece we've just talked about, who can you reach out and send personalized messages to? Can you respond on posts that are of interest and align to the goals that you have? Are you able to join relevant specific groups that are online, attend online events, being seen on these online events? On places like LinkedIn, you can follow donors and other relevant organizations. And those donors will see who's following them. You know what's most interesting to them at that moment. So then you have a slight bit more information about their interests before you directly approach them, perhaps. You have to really be proactive on these kinds of websites for them to be useful. I don't think you can dip in and then dip out. And you do have to really think carefully about what you share. You can't get rid of things that you post online entirely. So being conscious and respectful in terms of what you're putting on there. Sorry, my black boxes are popping up. There's different platforms that you can go to. Again, I'm not going to go on about this too much, but obviously different platforms help you find different types of people. So Facebook tends to be a slightly older demographic, really good for storytelling. X or Twitter has a slightly wider age range, but you can use hashtags that help you engage a wider audience, and it's really good for news. Instagram's all about pictures and storytelling through pictures and short video clips. You've got LinkedIn for your professional network and more formal reporting, studies, and there's opportunities for gaining credibility and connecting with donors. And then TikTok's kind of younger audiences. I'm sure you'll know other sites that I'm not at all connected to that are useful in different ways, but it's really having a think about what your goal is and what are the types of audiences that you want to reach and what you want to achieve through doing that. So it's keep going back to the purpose. That makes sense. I'm not going to talk too much about this online thing because I think a lot of the principles are the same for online and in person in actual fact, but just having that presence, I think, is more and more important, and giving it attention. That being proactive is probably the biggest and hardest piece to keep doing unless your mind is really in that space. What am I trying to share? How am I going to try and share it? Being really intentional about that. At events. So preparation is kind of key if you want to get the absolute most out of these things. Doing your research before you go, having that understanding, who's going to be there, what am I going to get out of this? Am I able to access a list of people who've been invited, or do I have an understanding of the organizations that are going to be there that I want to meet to help me achieve my goal? Can I research them online? using LinkedIn or whatever to be able to find out what's interesting to them right now. What work have they done in the past? How can this help me going forward? So doing a piece of research when you're about to go to a networking event can be really valuable. Then there's a piece about yourself and how you're going to tell your own story, how you're going to make a pitch. And that's not necessarily saying it's not a pitch necessarily about money. It can be about yourself. It can be focused on the goal that you've already identified. And I think this is kind of a thing that's been I think people talk about, is it elevator pitches? So something that's very clear and concise, summarizes who you are, what you do, and why you do it, highlights the value and impact of your work, and it's very clear. It's really worth spending time on your first, it might just be your first couple of sentences that you have with someone, but once you've got something really clear, it really helps engage somebody from the very beginning and helps them understand what you're all about. Oh, is somebody not, am I not, can you hear me, everybody? Just checking, because I can see somebody's not hearing. Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Just
Chung, just to check, you're in the English language interpretation room.
There we go. Thank you. Practice it, practice it, practice it. It's the kind of thing that you don't practice it with somebody who is perhaps more similar to the kind of person you're going to pitch to, or isn't necessarily an expert in what you're talking about. So it could be you're pitching to somebody who knows all of the acronyms, who knows all of the technical language that you use regularly in your work. Or it could be that you have to really work about thinking about how you explain what you're trying to do, what your organization is aiming at in language that really works for the person that you're working on. So just that practice and testing it with people, making sure that what you're saying is clear and gets that message across as soon as possible, is really, really valuable. We support masters here at Cambridge University in conservation leadership. And every year we run a networking session with them, and we do some practice ahead of them going in and being in a room full. So this picture is from one of those sessions, actually. So we invite them in with a room of donors or other interesting people, and they come and they practice the skills that they've thought about ahead of that meeting. Sorry, I'm checking my pop-ups aren't getting in the way. And they really talk afterwards about the value of the time they spent figuring out what their pitch was and practicing it with their colleagues before going into the room of people that they're networking with. So it's one I really recommend, but I think it's really hard to make the time and space to do that. But what you can get out of it, I think, is hugely increased. This is another one where I'd love you to put some thoughts in the chat. So when you've been at networking events, I would love us to kind of pile in a few ideas. We'll start on the do's. What things should you do at a network event that would help you in your networking? I would love us to pull some of our collective ideas here, because I know everybody who is here will have had some experience at some point at one of these sorts of things. I will give you just a minute or so just to have a little think about what are the real do's for networking? What are the things we should be doing at an event? What ideas have worked for you? And then we'll move on to the don'ts afterwards. I'll just give it a minute for you to have a think. Be approachable. Yeah, that's a lovely one. Pay attention to your appearance. Yeah, that was the one I was going to put on a slide. You only get that first one opportunity for a first impression. There used to be here in the UK advert for shampoo, an anti-dandruff shampoo, and that was their little sentence that they used to put out. So you only get one chance for a first impression. do look at the list of attendees and plan who you want to talk to. Yeah, dress appropriately, introduce yourself. So do be brave, have courage, be open-minded. That's nice. Be clear and concise, smile. Yeah, I think there's something about being positive, isn't there? Going in there and being really positive. Slow and steady on the arse, so not just going in there and barreling in and saying, "Can I have $20,000, please?" Believe in yourself. I love that. Do your research. Yeah. Find someone you know. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I've spoken to people where it's sometimes can be really helpful. You talk to somebody who's friendly and then you bring in two more people and then you split and bring in more people. It can be helpful to sort of work like that, work your way outwards. Reach out, establish contact, engage on a one-to-one level. There's some lovely tips in here. Not wear something that stands out. Oh, to wear something that stands out. Sorry, I read it absolutely the opposite. So people remember you and can find you. I love that. I need some brighter clothes. Clear objectives. Yeah, I think we're going to keep coming back to that because I think those objectives are absolutely key. Thank you. There's some really lovely ideas. I think there's something there about sort of being yourself, using your connections and experiences, being direct, humble, positive, having courage, being polite. Are some of the thoughts I have. Being genuine and curious about the people you meet. Don't just focus on selling your cause, but listen to what they have to say, show interest in their stories and perspectives. Ask open-ended questions, give compliments. These are some of the ideas that I pulled together. Share relevant anecdotes or insights that are relevant, not irrelevant. Be genuine and curious, and that builds rapport and trust. Show them that you care about them as individuals, not just for what you're seeking. So there are a few of those. Well, how about on the don'ts? Let's move to the don'ts. Oh, we've got one already. Don't for funding. Yeah. You've got to build that relationship first. Sometimes the objective is securing the next meeting rather than asking for money. If you get a let's meet at this time, by the end of your conversation, I think often that's really helpful. Don't monopolize the conversation. Yeah, that's a good one. So don't talk too much or say too little. This probably works on both ends. Yeah, don't do all the talking. It's almost some of the opposites of the other one. So do be positive, don't be negative. I've been to events before where I've had colleagues even that have been really they've really kind of over exaggerated some of the real situations, so it doesn't quite come across as genuine, or later on it becomes undone because they've sort of shown off a bit too far, or they've exaggerated about the size of something, and that kind of comes undone when you're building the relationship down the line. Don't underestimate people is another one I had. Be aware of sensitive topics. Yeah, and that's sort of partly to do with your research in advance, isn't it? Thanks, Garth. That's a good one. I said earlier that I had people like looking over my shoulders in the past, like looking for the next conversation. Don't be the person who does that. Don't rant. Yes, thanks, Denise. Don't necessarily underestimate the person that you're talking to as well. I think I've seen people do that before. Don't use technical terms or acronyms unless you know the person understands them. Don't misrepresent your organization. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. I think, for me, that exaggerating point was a similar sort of thing where you have to be honest. Don't just sit in the background, approach people. Yeah. I think so one of the pieces of advice I got from one of the CEOs I talked about at the beginning was, like, when you see the person you want to talk to, count to 3 and go straight to them, because the longer you wait, the more nervous you'll get and the harder it is to go and make that approach. And there's different tips around how you infiltrate a group. You know, when you in these networking places and you might have three people all huddled together deep in conversation, it can be hard to come into a conversation like that. So you spot the people who are on their own, or you see a couple of people who are a bit more open, that you're able to come into that conversation. Have you thought about how you leave a conversation? How do you move on in these sorts of events? How do you move on to the next person? I'd love to hear your views on that. Oh yeah, Lisa, thank you. That point about follow-ups, we'll talk about that coming up. But yes, get their contact details, share, and make sure you follow up. Exchange your contacts, say we'll stay in touch. Yeah. So have something that makes it easy for you to exchange your contacts. People don't use cards so much these days, I don't think. What do people do instead of using cards? They just share numbers directly onto their phones. Maybe digital cards. Yeah, that's where it's at. Yeah, following up. This piece about where it's the beginning of building a relationship. So if they're going to be somebody who's useful to you and you want to, you want to invite again, you need to be following up. Thank you. There's some really lovely insights in there. So I think some of these have come up already. So consider arriving early is one that we haven't mentioned. But if you get there early in these events, I think often people feel like it's a bit uncool to arrive early at a party. Certainly in the UK, that's like often the opinion. People will like arrive half an hour after something started. But if you arrive early, you can catch people before things get too busy. So it might be easier to find your person as they come in, or you can really get to know the host. And ask them questions about who's coming before people arrive. So yeah, lots of people have recommended arriving early, and it's not necessarily something everyone does, so there's advantage in that. Something about going in with the right mindset. So it can take quite a lot of energy to be this person who's on the ball in these kinds of events. It can be quite exhausting, but so spend a couple of minutes before you go in just building that positive mindset. There's some work, I'm trying to think of her name, that somebody's done around even how you hold your body before you go in. So if you hold like like legs apart, like hands on your hips, very open frame, apparently that can make you feel more confident going into a room, rather than if just before you go in you're all hunched up with your legs crossed and your arms crossed. That might make you feel less confident, and studies have been done to show how your I'm trying to think of the word, like it's like it builds up your testosterone so you're able to go into the room and be able to manage these conversations easier. We've talked about listening. We've talked about considering what value we can offer. We've talked about who we can go on to approach to move on. Yeah, that can be a really useful tip. So I've found this really useful. So when you've been talking to somebody who's actually not necessarily somebody who you've targeted, and you've sort of got to the end of the conversation, but they're holding on to you because they're a bit scared perhaps about who their next conversation is going to be on. And to enable you to move on, I found it really useful to introduce them to somebody else if there's somebody else in the room, or to bring somebody else into the conversation to take that over for them. But ultimately, you have to just sort of excuse yourself, sincerely thank them, and accept it's okay to move on. I'm at a networking type event, but I know that can be awkward for some people. And yeah, go for it. We've talked about that too. I'm going to move on. After we've met our person perhaps at our networking event and we want to follow up with them, we may end up in a one-to-one meeting. So this is the sort of meeting where we're following up. I'm hearing a slight echo. I'm wondering why. Where we're following up on that initial conversation we've had. We've got a bit of a relationship with someone enough to have them in a room. just with them. So there's a few things that we might want to think about in that scenario. So again, we're really focused on the objective of why we want to meet them in the first place. First of all, thinking about where you're going to meet them. So if you're the one inviting them and you're not just going directly to where they are. Yeah, so if you're inviting them to, meeting at a restaurant or a cafe or a small meeting space somewhere, think about what will give you the atmosphere. If it's going to be too loud, if there's going to be lots of other people talking, so you have to really shout at each other, that might be difficult. If you order a massive meal, for example, it might be hard for you to do all the talking that you want to do to get your point across. So having a little bit of pre-thought about those things. Again, it's planning ahead of the meeting. There's something about being practiced at storytelling when you're networking. So when you tell your story, even if you're fundraising for something that you might not directly have been involved in, it could be that some of you here are in that situation, to be able to tell a story from the heart, how it's impacted you, how it's important to things that are important to you, can make a real difference in terms of how you do that. So again, it's practicing how you might think about that, what sort of stories you might want to tell. I think Chloe already recommended the how can you stand out. That could be wearing something that makes you stand out. Perhaps that works still in a one-to-one meeting, but it might be more about what can you offer that's different to other people. I'm just thinking at Fauna Flora, we've been lucky enough to have David Attenborough as one of our vice presidents for a very long time, but he's signed a whole load of books for us, and sometimes we're able to give those books with David Attenborough's signature on, and if that's somebody who we're really trying to impress, that's really made a difference for us. So think, you don't want to give gifts to all of the people you're talking to, but if it's somebody who that would make a big difference to it, can really help make you stand out. There's something when you're getting into a conversation where there's something very specific that you want, about being flexible enough to pivot when you understand what their interests are and what their needs are. So don't keep going down the same avenue if it's not getting you anywhere. Be flexible, ask open-ended questions. I said there was lots of lists in this talk, didn't I? I wasn't joking. But it's just trying to remind me to think of things that I've been offered. So this was a piece of advice about don't bullshit. We've come across that, but be really realistic. Only offer to do things if you can absolutely deliver on them. Don't say you can do things that you can't do, because it will come out and it will make life difficult. And that first meeting that you have, you might not get to your goal. You're thinking about that long-term aim where you're building that relationship and you're building trust and you're sharing similar stories. So really see if you can focus on them and what they need to a degree. And the focus might only be getting another meeting rather than getting to your goal. You have to judge it as seems fit. But I think as long as you're being clear about what you want from the beginning, and if you have prepared something that summarizes what you're after, you can leave that with them if you're seeing them face to face, or if you're having a Zoom conversation, you can just send them that information so they've got it to refer, and that should have the key things that you're looking for or that you're trying to share with them in that message. I think this is all fairly obvious stuff. Just checking I've not got anything I've missed. Let's go on to the next slide. So we're getting towards the end. And this is the difficult bit, I think, is that after you've done this, first getting in touch with people, having that personal conversation with somebody, be it in a networking environment or following up on meetings one-to-one, is how we can take that forward. How can we evolve it to get to the place where we need to be? And I think people identified that this is one of the harder things to do, is to translate those people that are in your network into something useful. So consciously putting aside some space to reflect on what well and didn't go well. So if it was just you who was doing this networking, you might sit on your own and have a think about it. But if there were other people in your team or that are working towards the same goal that you can talk to and reflect with, and make plans for how can we adjust this as we go forward. Really make time for that reflection, and it's the hardest thing to do, to create that space. But again, my lessons learnt talking to these networking experts, and what I've picked up having listened to them, is that reflection time. I don't do it every time, but when I do, I've never regretted it. There's been times where we've had conversations with potential donors, and they've not gone quite as so I said about pivoting, they've not gone quite as we've hoped. So we've pitched an idea, they've not quite liked it, but have suggested another idea, and we've come back and we've sorry, I've got my pop-ups coming in, and we've come back and we've had a conversation about how we can turn it around and how we can then keep moving towards joined goals. So just the basics: sending a follow-up message, thanking them, reminding them of the conversation, and suggesting a next step. And make sure you do that quickly afterwards. It makes a big difference. If there are other people involved, so if you're approaching somebody who's important in any particular way, who has certain status, they might have assistants that support them. Recognize their assistants, thank their assistants, really pay attention to those people who are helping the person that you're trying to get at, because that will also influence how the follow-up works. So that's another sort of tip that's made a big difference in my experience previously. And then keep following up is this is all really, really obvious stuff. I'm conscious we're out of time. So the big idea is, this is my last slide. I want you to go away from here just thinking about who can I talk to, who's a really good who's a really good networker. Find someone who's fantastic at it and ask for tips. Ask for an introduction. So rather than going direct to the people, sometimes it can be easier to find somebody who knows a person. Ask for an introduction or an endorsement, and that can really help. If the networking events that are out there aren't meeting your goals, hold one yourself if you possibly can. Bring people to you, and it might be easier than you ever thought, and it might open doors that you never thought. And practice is the last thing. Practice and prepare. And that's what I'm going to leave you with today. I want to say thank you for everybody for all your contributions to the session. There were some really fantastic ideas. I know there's lots of expertise. I'm just going to stop sharing with you. Really fantastic ideas and thoughts that I hope everybody had a chance to read. Thanks for joining us, and good luck in your networking. I hope it goes really well.